Good morning. Also, from my side, thanks for the invitation. Thanks also for the introduction. And also thanks to Antonio Cruz, who presented his work. The work in Basel I know very well. I'm almost every day. I'm, to say so, embraced by this great work, this beautiful public work that is so important to us in Basel, and it's so important that this contemporary piece of architecture is this kind, is also serves as this most important, crucial public infrastructure element. So when I heard and listened to Antonio and how he was speaking about the Rijksmuseum experience and his images, I all of a sudden thought that maybe I could imagine that my children, or maybe the children of my children, might be in the position that there would be a project to exchange that infrastructure of his passerelle. And then I could, all of a sudden, I thought that thinking on his image of all the kind of people working in this department of restoration on this balcony, that all of a sudden there might be such a crowd of people on this Basel a platform of his protesting against that demolition. And all of a sudden I thought that there things change, and all of a sudden what looked to him to be this kind of protesting crowd of what he said, I think it was something like, I don't remember, but seemingly they did not care so much about architecture, but in a certain way they cared about the work of the former architect, to say so, and all of a sudden things become completely different. And by that, I think this would be a first comment on this issue of common space, and of course it had to do with this question of Luis Fernandez Galliano, who then is the client and who is the public. And of course this turns out to be different in every case, and I think that the public is always the client, and I think that's fine. And the people that will protest to keep their passage you designed in such a convincing way that this will become, and already became, such an important part of the city of Basel, that it will be expression of the greatness, the kind of great thanks expressed to you in a later generation, maybe. So when we were asked this year 2 times to lecture or to work on common grounds, and the first time it was for the Biennale in Venice, when David Chipperfield asked us, like a large series of architects, I think about 40 different architects, to share this experience of that Biennale under this issue of common grounds. And there we decided to participate, but the way David explained it, it seemed to us quite difficult to achieve, to contribute to it. And he said he would like to know what is the common culture, what is the common background that creates gestalt, that creates the specific shape of an architectural design. He said he is not interested to show schemes, designs, but he is just interested in presenting the conditions and the reasons behind the design. And so it is, of course, a vision, an idea also of the history of ideas that is behind this ambition. And in a certain way, we thought this is one interesting aspect, but it would, thinking on sharing such experiences of appropriating architecture as a presentation, we thought then that our own work would not be so incredibly interesting, and for people, for visitors of the exhibit to share. So, and this was one part, and the other part, the other thinking was that, as a matter of fact, what would really be interesting and for visitors is to debate architecture and to share those issues of common culture and specific culture behind architectural designs, while sharing the experience of the exhibition itself. So what we suggested and what we will do is that we asked 30 authors to write about all the pavilions in the Giardini, and our presentation will be the presentation of those essays of those authors, that they are all come out of that country, that the pavilions are the state that the pavilions are representing, and the visitors will be able to listen to those very personal appropriations of this architecture, also commentary of that architecture by downloading them and walking through the Giardini, or by reading them in the exhibition itself, or listening to them in that exhibition. And the complementary setting is a documentation, a photographic documentation of Gabriele Basilico, of all the pavilions that he anyway was going to do, and this together will then become this kind of installation that should deal about common grounds. So when we were fine with that until Luis Fernandez Galliano called and asked anyway to come here and to speak about common, the common grounds, common space, and doing that out of one's own experience as architect. So this time I could then not escape anymore. And also I think that it's like the question that has been evoked before showed clearly, as a kind of an entity, it's very difficult to answer, and answering by architectural schemes or urbanistic schemes is even more difficult. That means in any way it can only be some aspects of such of such a theme and of common. And so I will try by passing through a series of own experiences and projects to highlight certain aspects only of this common which concerns us today. I would start with one image, and the only image of a competition scheme we did in 2002, and because the project itself is not so important. It was a competition for high quality housing, high quality apartments, and that's not so unusual. But what was unusual is that these houses should become the kind of the setting of the monument that was just under construction of Peter Eisenman for the murdered European Jews. This fabulous monument he designed, and behind that monument today you can see one of the last projects of Plattenbau, this heavy prefabrication system of the German Democratic Republic, which this was one of the last that was still realized in the 80s, and in between one imagined to have a kind of a more decent and more sophisticated background for this monument. And contrary to all the other competitors, we refused this, and we thought that it would be impossible to try with such a real estate development to answer in a certain way the monument in front. And what we suggested was that we suggested just to extend this kind of Plattenbau of the 70s and 80s, of course, done in a modified way, and also not creating, like they do, just kind of flat screens in general, but to design it a way that it is referential in itself. And we thought that and we still think that this would be a more decent way to treat with that monument than just to think that a very beautiful, perfectly designed new housing scheme would fit much more there. So I thought I would tell about this experience, which was just one of the experience we had, that by being that our schemes were rejected. This happened quite often because we took positions which were in a certain way questioning the basis of the competition briefs. And but I took it because it also shows the first time that common is, of course, first of all the space of confrontation. And of course, when all of us, when we think on common space, when we think that this is the most important to create those common spaces and where people meet, where one communicates, this is all true, but it has as many facets as life has, and this is, of course, also therefore this kind of confrontation, example showing the confrontation that we had something different in mind concerning the identity of public space than already the jury had, which is a kind of representative of a public community. This shows already this kind of impact of controversy, controversial dialogue between within the field of kind of experts. Then there is this other much larger field that we spoke about before. Our idea of common and our way to try to behave well within that common space has a lot to do with the idea of a European city that was built up through a long-lasting period, and that became specific by that time, and to figure out about specific sites and specific identities, and to try to develop out of such kind of identities, then to build up the new design out of them is a kind of, in simple words said, is a kind of a permanent attempt of ours, and a way also to think that this could be maybe the best chance for us also to share and to make our design understandable within a larger audience. So the next scheme, the first, as a matter of fact, the first build scheme I would show here is the one for the extension of the Swiss Embassy in Berlin, which we built. The competition was in '95 and it was built in 2001. And it was also a kind of a complex experience, and of course this complex experience to build on a site where almost all the buildings have been demolished during the World War, partly because of the Allied bombardments, but even more by the German Nazi regime that destroyed all the buildings because to build there the kind of megaloman Speer designed the Hall of Fame that was intended to be built there. And to rebuild there is, of course, extremely controversial experience, and our design is marked as much as from demolition and also from the absence of houses, also as it is also a kind of expression of almost archaic reconstruction, a composition of the old and new elements to gain a kind of an entity, but of course an entity which in itself is very complex. And we worked from the very first moment already within the competition period with Helmut Federle, a originally Swiss artist living in Austria, and because we asked him to also to work with us, because we had in mind from the very first moment that we would have to keep that gable wall, which is just opposite the government, German government, the Bundeskanzleramt, and he designed this kind of monumental relief for that wall in sheer concrete. This, by the way, was the way it looked like before, and you would discover the building of the Swiss embassy here, which was, of course, part of the overall Grand Bourgeois Alsenquartier, and the building itself was the house of the founding. This palais was the house of the founding director of the Charité Hospital. So that's the way it looked between since the war was finished, and then this was also the condition we found it in 1995. This shows it's not because of Christo's work, but I didn't find another photo. Unfortunately, it's not so clear. But here is the only house left at all beside the Reichstag itself was that Swiss embassy. That, of course, the Germans hesitated to demolish because it was already the Swiss representation during the Second and before the Second World War. So this was an extension later on with two axes, and then finally this was a model for the competition entry, showing the kind of condition to keep this condition of that house in between two gable walls, but the new gable wall is not the gable wall of a new building, but only a wall by itself. And on the other side, it was the extension for the offices for the Swiss chancellery. So this project provoked quite a lot of discussions, and today it's not anymore like that. At the beginning, it was a very sharp public debate. What was left is also that this debate was also reflected even within the field of politicians. So Gerhard Schröder, who was the chancellor at that time, he quite liked this kind of gable wall he looked at, while, for instance, Thierse, the president of the parliament, considered it as a shame, and this bill that one should really even exchange again, not only the gable wall, but even more, I guess, our extension. And meanwhile, it's in a way accepted more and more. And the curators of monuments and so on, they were always in favor of this scheme, and it even opened to me a kind of a deeper dialogue with the city of Berlin since I think 2004 or so. I'm member of the Council on Historic Monuments in Berlin, and to expertise on contemporary transformations. So this experience now from a second design leads to a kind of a more to a third design, which was not which was also controversial, less by itself, but by the fact that one has had to demolish unfinished museum extension that before, and probably because of that reason, this project was never built until now. Was not built. It is about the museum's extension of the National Gallery in Rome, and we suggested as a kind of a third corpus. This was the original pavilion for the exhibition, built for an exhibition but kept as a permanent element, monumental exhibition space on one floor, designed in 1911, and then by the same architect, Cesare Bazzani, the extension still in the same neo-eclecticist and neoclassical style in 1933. And then there was, in the 60s, there are ruins of an unfinished third extension. We suggested a kind of an extension which was, in a certain way, very much a kind of considered as a succession of the existing. Still, we were looking for a kind of a different, more fluent space and of course, we did not work within the kind of hierarchic systems that were still kept in the 1933 of Bazzani, that goes back to the palace typology with antichambre and chambre. So, but to have just a series of exhibition spaces that they change in shape, and that there is also unexpected kind of accesses, so it is different from that, but still it was this idea that one drives you to the next. And this kind of building up the new scheme out of the existing, out of what was also common there, what is the experience, but introducing also the elements of the late 20s or post-war or 20th century architecture, and bringing that, trying to create a kind of more complex but still kind of entity seemed to us a kind of an interesting challenge. And it was not only a work in the floor plan, to say so, in the organization of space, but we tried to remain coherent in the way we worked also on the elevation, on the skin of the building. And what you see the new wing on the left side, and what we suggested was that since it would be also the new entry for the temporary exhibitions, which we thought that it could be a kind of a striking experience to show part of the huge archive of sculptures of that National Museum within, as a kind of system of storage, but within the facade. So behind glass, of course, and open to the interior, like which is a kind of entrance hall, and at the same time auditorium that one can adapt, and by that also creating a kind of a specific atmosphere like in a theater place. And there are already on one side there is already the public listening as a series of those sculptures. So by doing so, we, of course, we refer to the kind of neoclassic sculpture that one cannot see on this elevation, but which is very present in the existing buildings from 1911 and 1933. So that, and one other aspect is that we suggested that the presentation of the sculptures would not be like in the exhibition space, but really in terms of a storage condition, like you have it in gypsotecas. That means that one could work on them in a kind of scientific way, or to restore rather, but not that they are presented in a kind of speculation as a presentation piece. So that was the small also kind of transformation we suggested for the monumental entrance of the original entrance front. Now, after those kind of public discussions and on buildings that they have a public character, and that also that the buildings itself were concerned. Now this is about the commentary on common that has to do with the common space, and it is a project that some of you might know, since it is also it was already finished in 2000. And it is about the Java and KNSM island, which was fully urbanized, completely urbanized in the 80s and 90s. And this is the plan. You might know better that Borneo and Spornburg design, which of course is very spectacular, also with all the row houses, and this was the last part of this urbanization of this part of the port of Amsterdam, which was not anymore used since everything happened in Rotterdam. So there was a radical project of urbanization of Jo Koenen on that wing, and of Sutter, another urban designer, on that other wing. And this was also finally realized, and there was just an issue about this kind of entrance to this to that island, because there were two super blocks, and that one a very beautiful, I think, a masterpiece of that in late 20th century architecture of Hans Kohlhoff and Helga Timmermann. And then the discussion was about that one, and then there was another small competition among 4 firms, because there was no kind of agreement found on this former plan. And what we suggested is to give up this kind of urbanization of large-scale scheme, like maybe the reference of the Viennese blocks, but to work out just 2 houses, one which is built just on the waterfront, and the square one here as a solitary building. And they referred much more to the history of that site as a port area, an industrial area. And we also were trying to refer with our floor plans to that, on one way, to the relation, this kind of exchange of goods that had happened between the water and the island, and then also with this kind of square building cantilevered that reminded more morphologies of port buildings, that storage buildings, that they then kind of organized the way that goods then were distributed from the port area to a city. So what is, I think, important to say in our concerning our theme is that we think that the urban space it has a lot to do with this, with the connotation of a space, with the history of a site, and that those connotations, they might be more important and more influential also for us than kind of space considerations of space, of creating beautiful urban spaces. We believe that first of all one has to work with the identity of the space, and we would rather build up also the vision of the sheer geometrical conditions of a urban site out of that such a connotation of that heritage, to say so, then to try first of all to create a kind of an interesting and appropriate design in a traditional, within the kind of tradition of urban design. So this seems important to us, and this goes now even further to the interior, to the organization of space. Here, by the way, this kind of expression of those 140-meter housing, which every apartment two of those windows, and the windows, they are slightly shaking, half a brick. You would not see it from your eye probably, or discover it, but it is important to avoid this kind of sharp geometric grids that we did not, that was not our intention at all. Now just showing the floor plan from closer from the second house that we built up within this idea of storage houses, and we organized almost the structure of the spaces like a storage space, and we introduced the apartments within those spaces. That means, contrary to modern architecture housing that was very much organizing typologies of apartments and then creating the shape of the house out of considerations of the organization of the apartments. We here, there, we did it the other way around, and we built, to say so, first the structure, and then we filled it up. And it's a kind of a balcony entrance system, and you come into the large common a kind of mall you share, and then there are always individual rooms. We could do so because there was the apartment, the program asked for apartments for, not for families, but for people living together in short communities. And so we designed this structure, and you see that here you have the same typology. Also the shape of the apartment is a different one. And as a matter of fact, such apartments, finally, they rather look like apartments one finds when you're transforming a former industrial structure, for instance. But we found them even more interesting than our own traditional shaping of apartments we are often doing. Yeah, the play of the windows has to do with the structural organization of the walls. And then this has not so much to do with our theme, but still I would mention that this idea of working within such a given structure then also led to another design as one of the houses for the Olympic Village in Torino, where we even exaggerated more this kind of structure, and there we reached a kind of a condition that almost the apartment itself was squatting and trying to find to occupy the spaces that are not yet occupied by the next apartment, and then we also suggested kind of rather to give up the distinction between the spaces between traditional room and the bathrooms, for instance, which of course was also very beautiful and fitted well, since it was a house for athletes and for them to care about their bodies. Of course, comes close also to the vision of modern architecture, who also insisted a lot on that aspect. So you see, this was unfinished, but it was surprising all of a sudden. Of course, there became then 2 curtains, so one could feel comfortable. And this is also how then that looked like. In the upper floors, you might have seen before, we introduced kind of atriums going down almost 3 floors. Now, this kind of this became even larger with the master plan. This idea of connotation of a certain site became more important in the larger scale of the Malmö University, which was founded in the year 2000. Surprisingly enough, Malmö decided to build a university in the year 2000, while other cities cut down their faculties, and so it had to do with a tremendous bad economy in Malmö, a former shipbuilder city without any, with 25% of unemployed people I think in 2000, and there was a kind of very strong public will to create the infrastructure for a better education of the population, and therefore just in front of the old city and the railway station, all this area was bought to build up the university. Everything had to go fast. It was limited. It was a competition among only about 6 or 7 teams, and finally we were commissioned. And here too, what happened is that we had this kind of reference of existing buildings, structures, industrial structures still running, North Mills called, and this kind of neighborhood also brought us to suggest to give up traditional urban to figure out traditional urban spaces, but we suggested just to create such patterns and clusters that could develop, forgetting about an idea of a common public space, but let those buildings and faculties to develop themselves. And this then, we ourselves as architects were just commissioned with the first building, in which we also wanted to introduce this kind of specific genes of an adding a structure, growing structure. It's also a very complex program organized by like 10 different faculties within one building, and that's then the way it turned out to be. To go even to jump a last time into that, the interior is a high-end headquarters building of the Novartis firm in Basel, the very first of a campus that was designed by Vittorio Lampugnani. And what was the kind of specific issue about it was that it was the change of the whole that whole firm towards a concept of open space offices, and it is about 55,000 working places around the world which are organized out of Basel, and this should became the very first building that was now worked as open space, so-called open space offices. For us, it opened a kind of an idea of creating a skin which would not point out anymore one space or one window, but to make it to become one skin. And it had also once more to do with the site. It was the site of the color, of the production of colors. That was the beginning of the pharmaceutical industry in Basel. And once more we worked with Helmut Federle, this artist, and we suggested to cover the whole building with a skin of colored glass designed by him and his friend and his friend Gerold Wiederin, and this was supposed to become the entrance building, the flagship, to say so, for this Novartis campus. And so we suggested a building that should not be a kind of a signature architecture. It should be something outstanding from out of our work, and it should be outstanding out of the work of Helmut Federle. And the reference we suggested was the one of the library in Mexico City. You might know this one, this box, beautiful box that was completely covered with the mosaic that also became so significant for this site, with this Aztec art of the Aztec, and also of socialist realism, and a beautiful kind of artistic, of an art piece, and that was for us a kind of a reference. The interior was also had to change, and the metaphors had to change, and we suggested a kind of a site plan of a city, the plan of a city as a plan to organize those working spaces, and we suggested to keep fixed elements like monuments in the kind of tradition of rationalist Italian architecture. And that's the way it looks like. And one idea is to keep the glass not that abstract quality we are used to, but to use the glass as a mass. And this is really what happens. And if you approach there, it doesn't remind you on other glass buildings. It rather reminds you on I don't know, Palazzo Pitti or so. It rather reminds you on a Renaissance rustico than on a glass building at first sight. So those masses are so present. Now the very last project I go very quickly through because it leads also to the beginning, was the extension of the of the east wing by rebuilding the east wing of the Museum of Natural History in Berlin, which we opened at the end of 2010, and it was an aisle of a building that was destroyed in the war, and there was no money during all the years in the German Democratic Republic to build up this wing of the museum. And finally, the competition was held in '95, but again there was no money left until 2007 to start. And we were all the time, we became the house architects, repairing the roofs and so. All the stuff one has to do in such a large structure every year, and we like to do that because it really fits to our understanding of architecture and of buildings, that one has to care about all the time, and everything is important to them. And then, but finally, there was a budget left for this reconstruction, and our concept from the beginning was to reorganize and to concentrate a kind of extremely interesting collection of what is called the wet collection. That is, there are glasses with about 300,000 objects, that fishes and amphibian, that they are kept within those glasses, that they are filled up with a kind of an alcohol, and they were kept under very bad conditions. And to keep this unique collection, one had to create a completely different space without any daylight, with ideal conditions, low temperature, because not to risk an explosion. So all that collection was organized within that new wing on 18 meters, on 3 levels of 6 meters, that they were divided in two, and that also offered the space to re-accommodate this other parts of the museum. We suggested that this part would be partly shown to the public, because the main issue of this house is that it is a research house, a research museum, belongs to the Humboldt University, and they kept the whole collection in the house, while other museums by many reasons, good reasons, they put their collection somewhere else under good conditions in different houses, and they only had the presentation. It was only a showcase, and what you went to see. And in Berlin, this was kept in another way. The upper floors from the beginning were for the scientific collection. The ground floor was reserved for the public collection, because this is completely different from the very first day. One has to decide whether it will be prepared. The preparation work will be done for a public presentation or for the scientific collection. And then we suggested that in this case, on ground floor, people should have access, and we introduced this kind of collection within the conditions, also within the levels of the museum. So it was like the other part of the collection. It was really linked and connected on all levels still for the scientific work with the museum. But on ground floor, we reduced the width to make it possible to have a look into that collection. But this collection is, of course, organized in the scientific way. That means you would not recognize anything. There is no indication of any of those specimen, but it is just organized from the interior, and you might also see people to work in that interior. And it's a kind of overwhelming experience to enter that space and to be in front of those dead animals. And it reminds maybe a kind of the experience of Stillleben, because there also you have this kind of presence that is so close very often of dead bodies, corpses, that they are represented in Stillleben. So since the walls had to be completely closed and the interior and the exterior had to be rebuilt, you see here this exterior, and it was decided to keep what is left from those external walls, and that meant to make a closed wall for the existing and to fill up with a wall the openings of the still remaining parts. We came to the suggestion that we would really cover it with a concrete wall, build up the non-existing walls with concrete walls, but we suggested to cast the kind of as a surface to cast the former facade within that concrete wall with all the windows, everything left. We had this from the next wing. It was easy to take it away and to organize it for that casting, which of course was then a kind of an ambitious work to do. There were huge elements that they had to be produced, and finally you can see how that looks like in the factory, how that looked, those elements, they looked like when they were built up. And this is then the way it looks, and it shows this kind of, it's a very surprising and very strange experience, because as a matter of fact, you would not immediately recognize it, but once you would recognize it, you would see that it is not built out of different elements, but it is more like a kind of a petrified skin, or it might remind more on techniques of the surrealistic painters like Max Ernst with his frottage works or so. And then that this is the last, to say so, this last reference. When we tried to also to convince the responsibles to do it, to let it be done that way, we showed this reference. It's a painting of Franz Marc, Tierschicksale from 1913. It's part of the collection of the Basel Kunstmuseum, and Franz Marc, the building was half demolished, not by fire, but by the water that should protect the painting from the fire. And then Paul Klee, who was a close friend of Franz Marc, completed it after the First World War. Franz Marc, he died during the war, and Paul Klee completed it, but without adding or completing it within the colors, the original colors, but with much less of much less colorful, and this created this kind of quality that you would, of course, not, that the existing and the original painting would not be compromised by this completion, but on the other hand, clay created anyway, again, the quality of the overall composition, and this it was also about, of course, in this museum of Tide in Berlin, that we wanted by our reconstruction of the East Wing regain this original monument also as an urban monument. So that's it, and thank you for your attention.